And so it meant that really I had a job to do. And that job was to tell the story of the Premier League clubs who had originally started as church clubs. And then I could tell the boys, look, you're part of a rich tradition. You're not freaks. Just look at these big names here. Manchester City, Tottenham Hotspur, Everton, Liverpool, Fulham, Southampton, etc., etc.
Hello and welcome to this special two-part episode here on Onside, where faith meets football, brought to you by Good News Broadcasting. I'm Eamon, and with me is my co-host Warner. And on this episode, we have Peter Lupson joining us. Peter is a historian and the author of Thank God for Football, which looks at the different football clubs in the UK that can trace their roots back to churches and Christian groups. So we're very honoured to have him on the show today to talk about the history of football and how Christianity has played an integral part in the creation of many football clubs that we know today. Thanks for joining us, Peter. How are you?
You're very welcome, and thank you very much for the invitation, Eamon. I'm well, thank you, and I'm very much looking forward to talking to you.
And so we'll start off how we always do. We'll start with the questions that we ask every single guest who comes on this show. What football team do you support?
Well, traditionally, I've supported Norwich City.
Wow,
but I've lived on Merseyside for over 50 years and have adopted Everton as co-equal with Norwich City.
Co-equal, so nice.
Both of them matter to me.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on the 10-point deduction?
Well, it's painful. Clearly, something went wrong that shouldn't have gone wrong. Yeah. So people generally accept that a punishment is deserved. I know that one or two other clubs are looking nervously over their shoulders now because they've done similar things, I understand. So let's watch this.
My club is one of the two. And we're not in a good Chelsea. And things aren't going well on the pitch, and they've not been going well off the pitch.
For me, as a Manchester United fan, seeing, the other half, the City side of Manchester with all these charges, I'm rubbing my hands together and I'm praying, Lord, please send them down to League Two, send them down to the conference. Just get them gone.
That's not very Christian of you, Eamon.
That's the only way you'll win again.
I must say,
especially as Manchester City is a club of church origin, and Manchester United.
Here we go. No,
it's true. It's true.
The Devils.
It's a battle. It is a battle. Being nicknamed the Red Devils, it's not really great. What's your best footballing memory?
Well, it's connected with Norwich City. And it was when I was 12 years old, Norwich City, as a third division South club, worked their way through the cup rounds all the way to the semi-final. And it was unheard of that a club that small with no real pedigree should be knocking out the likes of Manchester United in the third round, 3-0, Tottenham Hotspur and others. And it was only after a replay against Luton that Norwich were knocked out and didn't play Forest in the final. Now, what was interesting for me was I grew up in a little city called Ely, famous cathedral city. The nearest football club to me at the time was Norwich, 50 miles away. Ipswich was also 50, so was Colchester. But it was Norwich that captured my imagination because during that cup run, the radios in the shops in Ely High Street were all broadcasting the commentaries. And there was a fever that spread from Norwich right over to Cambridgeshire. And I got caught up in that, and it was magical. I can still recite that team at top speed.
So clearly you've had a love for football from, very, very young. How did the interest between the link between football and faith first begin and kind of develop into, pursuing it at a more specialized section?
Well, it was because of the fact that boys in our church attended church on Sunday morning and therefore didn't play in the local football leagues for youngsters. Yeah. And when they were asked on Monday, who did you play for yesterday morning? They would say, well, we went to church. And they were laughed at. And they found this very painful. And so I started a five-a-side internal league within the church, and we played on Monday evenings. And they enjoyed it so much. They said, well, could we not play against other churches and make it 11-a-side? And so we did that. And I formed a church league playing on Saturday mornings, and it went very well. But there was one big drawback. It wasn't seen as cool to play in a church league as it was in a non-church league.
Yeah.
And boys found it difficult to cope with some of the barbed comments, such as, oh, church leagues don't count, you're all soft, bet you use Bibles as shin pads, these kind of comments.
Wow.
And, you know,
Wow.
Merseyside is football mad, and football is taken extremely seriously. So comments like that actually hurt. And some boys dropped out.
Right.
And I thought, this is terrible that they're being penalized for playing in a church team or church league. And when I made the connection that Everton was of church origin and the other big local team, Liverpool, is an offshoot of Everton, I told them, look, next time you get this verbal abuse, just remind them that Everton and Liverpool owe their existence to a church.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking, are there other clubs that fall into this category? So that I can tell the boys that they're not freaks, but they're part of a rich tradition. And so I started digging around, and I found that there were altogether, I researched 100 clubs, and 25 of them had some debt to Christian influences. And some of them were actually the outcome of churches. And I decided to do this research and made contact with all the clubs who had played in the Premier League so that I could find out how the church is still related to those clubs. And to my horror, I discovered that some of the clubs didn't even realize that they had church links. And those that did only had very shadowy information. And so it meant that really I had a job to do. And that job was to tell the story of the Premier League clubs who had originally started as church clubs. And then I could tell the boys, look, you're part of a rich tradition. You're not freaks. Just look at these big names here: Manchester City, Tottenham Hotspur, Everton, Liverpool, Fulham, Southampton, etc., etc.
Yeah, that's so good. So in going back on something you mentioned there, that kind of almost, I don't know if conflict's the right word, but the kind of tension between the ambitions of like sporting play and then pretty much every church will meet on a Sunday morning, some maybe evening or something like that. But there's always this kind of constant tug and pull of, you know, do you want to play a sport, whether it's football for us or rugby or whatever, or go to church? So how did you find that experience? And obviously having then created something, what's your kind of perspective on that now, as far as how do you encourage young people to kind of go into that space, but as well as trying to maintain their faith in that aspect?
Well, clearly, the fact that we played football in our league on a Saturday tells you that we didn't want the boys to be robbed of their Sunday morning church experiences. So obviously, I put the church at the top and didn't start playing on a Sunday morning. In terms of Sunday football as such, it's a difficult one because there have been players in the past who have refused to play on a Sunday and also on Good Friday and on Christmas Day, and have become known for that. But it's a difficult one because it's recreation for the supporters, but it's work for the players. And the thing about the players is that those who are Christians are not marginalized from worshipping because their own churches are very supportive. And also there's an organization called Christians in Sport, which gives invaluable support to these players, and not just players, but also other members in the club. And they do Bible studies and have prayer times together. So they're not deprived of spiritual influences.
One of the things that you kind of said sort of early on is that there is this kind of rich tradition of football clubs who can trace their roots back to Christian influences and churches and things. And you said out of the 100 that you researched, 25, I think you said, could trace their roots back to kind of Christianity. And some of the clubs you mentioned, Everton and Liverpool, Man City, Fulham, Southampton. Are there any other clubs that were started out as churches or started out by a group of Christians? And why did these churches or Christian groups start these clubs? Was it an evangelistic tool or was it something else?
Well, basically, at the time, it was felt that football was a way of developing Christian character. Most of the clubs were formed for, as the founder of Fulham Football Club said, the Reverend Cardwell, he said that for him, it's about fun and friendship. He called it recreation and good fellowship for the Sunday school boys. But he wouldn't have just recommended that game ad lib at random. Football was seen to be a character building sport, in particular, the qualities of fair play. You don't cheat, courage, you don't duck a difficult challenge, unselfishness, you play for the team, not for yourself, and self-control. You don't retaliate if somebody crunches you. And these are difficult qualities to develop. I mean, look at players nowadays. How many of them exemplify all those four qualities? Now, football was seen to create in young people a set of values that they could live by, not just on the football field, but off the football field. So when churches encouraged youngsters to play football, it was with that in mind, not just as a time killer. Now, in terms of the clubs that have direct links with churches, by which I mean they either played in the name of the church with the permission of the minister, or the minister, vicar, actually founded them, there are 14 clubs that can actually say, we are of direct church descent. There are 6 more who have indirect links. In other words, there were strong Christian influences in the initial clubs they were in. 2 were formed by other Christian organizations. Burnley can trace its roots to the YMCA, and Leyton Orient to Homerton Teachers Training College in London at the time, which was run by the Congregational Church. And there are 3 clubs that had much looser connections. So, for example, Darlington are known as the Quakers, but they have nothing to do with Quaker faith. It was decided when they were formed to acknowledge the positive influence of the Quakers on the town. And so they incorporated a Quaker hat into their club crest as an acknowledgement that the Quakers set a moral standard that they would like to honor. So Liverpool is an offshoot of Everton, so not directly from a church, but as we'll discuss later, you'll see that their connection with the church that founded Everton remained very close. And I'll talk about that later. So 25 altogether with Christian influences, 14 directly from churches.
And so the players that kind of played for these clubs, nowadays, the players who kind of come from these football clubs, they either come up from the kind of the youth system and the youth program, but a huge amount of players come from transfers. They come from all over the world, big money, millions and millions of pounds. They pay for these players. And so they kind of come from here, there, everywhere. But starting off, that wasn't obviously a huge thing for many years within football. And so were the players who were playing for these church teams or teams that were kind of playing in the name of a church, were they members of the church? Were they just members of the local community, or a bit of a mix?
It was mostly, in fact, almost exclusively, because they were already involved in the churches. Now, for example, 6 of them came directly from Sunday schools. And I can tell you some interesting origins in that sense. Aston Villa owe their existence to Henry Hartshorne, who was the Bible class teacher at the Methodist Church in Aston, and he got them going. Bolton owe their origin directly to the Reverend Joseph Farrell Wright, who was the vicar of Christ Church, and he wanted something for the boys in the Sunday school. It was the same for Fulham. It was also the same for Tottenham. It was John Ripshire, who was the Bible class teacher, who actually spearheaded the birth and development of Tottenham Hotspur. So Sunday schools played a very significant part. There were other organizations that churches ran, which were also the cradles of their clubs. One was the Boys Brigade, the choir of Birmingham City Football Club, the choir of Trinity Church, the working men's meetings at Manchester City. That was a society set up to encourage working men to learn about the Christian faith. And it was from within that circle that the players came. And at Southampton, it was an organization called the Young Men's Association. Now, that's not to be confused with the YMCA, because the YMA was something specific to the church in Southampton, St. Mary's. They did more than just attend Bible classes. They were also expected to contribute to the life of the parish. So that meant they had to sing in the choir, they had to take Sunday school classes, and they had to do some outreach as well.
Yeah, that's really good. As the clubs kind of began to form as their own kind of entities and that type of things, were there particular practical elements of faith that were still in place there, or did that kind of, do you then start to see a bit more of a divesting earlier on? So as you're saying, like a lot of them at the beginning were very much involved in kind of the church life, really. Did that seep into the organization at some point, or was it almost like, did they kind of become two separate things?
Well, the interesting thing is that the players obviously were involved with the respective organizations that they were in, Sunday school, Boys Brigade, or whatever. But the influence of the clergyman was crucial. The more powerful the spiritual influence and climate of the church, the more likely the link with that church would persist. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples of the kind of spiritual context in which these players were moving. So, for example, Southampton. The first president of Southampton was Canon Basil Wilberforce, who was the rector of St. Mary's Church, where the club was formed. And in the parish magazine, he made this statement: personal fellowship with Christ is the secret of quietness and peace amongst brethren. In like manner, it's the source of heart rest in the difficulties of life. To be a Christian is not to profess a faith or to conform to a creed. It is the acknowledgement of a close connection between Christ and the soul. It is not the imitation of a perfect model, but the indwelling of a spiritual power. Now, that was the context in which those Southampton players moved. That was the climate in which their club was formed. Now, another good example, I'll read you this one as well. One club did have a distinct outreach program, and that was Fulham. And it was through one of their mission churches called St. Augustine's, which was near St. Andrew's, which is the mother church. And that church was joined by a curate called Peregrine Propert. I'll say that again, Peregrine Propert. It's not an easy name.
Sounds like a tongue twister.
Yeah. He was one of the top oarsmen of his day, a renowned sportsman. And he had a heart for cabyard youths who cleaned the carriages of the nobility. And these cabyard youths were looked down upon because of their foul language. They looked dirty and all the rest of it. But he wanted to reach out to them through sport. And this is what he wrote. And again, it shows you the heart, the commitment of so many of the clergy who were involved at that time. And this is what he said: among them, I worked and made some of my best friends, some of whom remain so to this day. On Saturday, we had very simple sing-songs, and some came to our services on Sundays. We had a gymnasium, and boxing became very popular. At this time, I was rowing for the Thames Rowing Club First 8, And when I brought home silver trophies and cups, it produced great excitement and admiration. My association with these fellows, whose language was not always classical, produced much criticism from the respectable, some of whom went so far as to say I was not fit to be a clergyman and reported me to the bishop, Dr. Temple. I explained to Dr. Temple that I'd come not merely to preach, but to apply Christian principles as far as I could in Lily Road. I believe I convinced the good bishop that my critics did not really understand the gospel message. And he quotes from Matthew, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And he goes on and says, I think even now the church has largely forgotten this truth. We are terribly respectable. Now, that's a powerful statement.
That's fantastic quote, yeah.
Because it shows that reaching out to others didn't always win you applause if the others were not socially acceptable. So that was, I think, really important. I'll give you one more example because it shows the breadth of commitment clergymen had to righteousness, fair play, and the qualities I mentioned earlier. Swindon Town were created by the Reverend William Baker Pitt. And he created the club because the two halves of Swindon were at war with each other. One half was called the Old Town, the other was called the New Town, which was inhabited by workers of the Great Western Railway who had flooded into the area because of the growth of the railway industry there. And there was this hostility across the divide, and he wanted to bridge it by forming a football club. And he managed to do this. He created this club from players from both sides of the divide, and he called it Swindon Town Football Club. Now, they weren't brilliant players. It wasn't the club that made any kind of impact. And in 1911, they made their first major breakthrough into consciousness, football consciousness, when they won the Southern League Championship. Now, that was the equivalent to the championship nowadays. And it was something special to achieve. And he was invited back, having moved to another parish in between. He was invited back as a special guest at a huge celebration at the county ground on the pitch to commemorate this event. And this is what he said to them. And again, this shows the spiritual context in which these early football clubs operated. He said this, I cannot say that we ever achieved any great results. We always played for the love of the game. No one congratulates the team more than I do upon the success which it has achieved. But perhaps there is one thing I congratulate the club upon more than upon its success, and that is its possession of a personal influence which makes for sobriety, purity, and the right observance of the Sunday. And I have no hesitation in saying that the success which has attended the team is very largely due to that influence. In other words, the Christian spirit of fair play. And at that time, they had a player called Harold Fleming playing for them, who was the only player ever to have played for England, while a Swindon Town player, who was known throughout the world of football for his Christian stand. He would not play on a Good Friday. He would not play on Christmas Day. And had there been Sunday football, he wouldn't have played. And people said of him, in passing through life, he shone a light that has never gone out. And he is the man, I think, that the person I just quoted, Reverend William Baker Pitt, was thinking of as the embodiment of that spirit that pervaded Swindon Town Football Club then, which was a legacy of what he had started.
Well, that's all the time we have for this first part of the episode. We hope you've enjoyed learning about the fascinating history of football and its Christian connections. Catch the next episode for part 2 of our conversation. But in the meantime, if you would like some more biblical-based podcasts and programs, simply head over to our website, gnba.net. That's gnba.net. But thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next one.